Welcome, everyone. This is Pat Bailey, Director of Training at Out and Equal Workplace Advocates. You just joined our April 2015 monthly town call, and this is the last of our virtual summits, which has been a series where we've selected some of the best workshops from the 2014 summit and converted them to a webinar format. So you'll hear about that today. This is a broadcast audio, so you should be able to hear us through your speaker. So either turn your computer volume up or use your headsets. The call will go from 12 to 1 o'clock. It will be recorded if for some reason you have to leave early for a meeting or you want to save that. Also, as a registrant for the call, you'll get a follow-up email that will have a link with the slides and the contact and any information that comes up during the call. If you're having any problems, you can use the chat box, which is on the bottom left, to talk to the presenters and myself as the co-chair and be able to fix that. And everybody signed in. So we welcome everybody to the last of our virtual summit and to April. And this is some of the other things that are coming up this month. Out and Equal has a lot of programs. We are just completing our live Building Bridges toward LGBT cultural competency webinar program. It's a set of 3 webinars that we've been doing over the last 3 weeks. The last one is next week. Those will also be available as recorded webinars once that finishes. So again, outandequal.org, outandequal.org, and you'll be able to go to training and Out and Equal University to find that information. Starting on May 12th, we'll have our trainers forum. If you're a trainer, it's a option for you to learn more what's going on and network with the other trainers. And then starting on May 17th, we're going to do Train the Trainer. If you're interested in being a peer educator in your workplace and community, it's a great opportunity to take the information that we're training on and be able to get that information out. And those 3 classes are noted there. Next month in May, we'll talk a little bit more at the end, but we're going to talk a little bit about self-ID. And make sure that if you haven't already joined our Out and Equal Communities platform, we've recently migrated over to Salesforce, and there's a link there that we can also send out that you can self-enroll. Once you get there, you can join regional affiliates. We have the Trainers Network. We have the Self-ID group. There's lots of information and resources. So please make sure that you stay connected all through the month. And again, we want to welcome everyone and thank all our presenters. And so I'm going to turn it over to our moderator for the call for today, and I'll be in the background chatting. Be sure to send in your questions and comments, and we'll track those for the Q&A. But Tony, over to you.
Thanks, Pat. Welcome, everybody. We're really excited to have you on today. We have a great topic on the cost of inconsistency, freedom to marry, and the LGBT mobility. And these were all from the 2014 San Francisco Summit. And so I will let each of the presenters introduce themselves. So we have Katie, Michael, and Scott, but we'll start with Katie to introduce herself, and we'll just move through that. Katie?
Hi, my name is Katie Kopansky, and I work as a strategy consultant for Oliver Wyman for healthcare companies. I was approached by Oliver Wyman and Marcia McLennan to help write the Cost of Inconsistency report based on my background in economics and my work in regulated industry.
Hi everyone, my name is Michael Grover. I'm a global mobility consultant based in the UK, and I'm also the co-chair of Mercer's LGBTA network in London.
Hi, this is Scott Davenport. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Freedom to Marry, and I used to be a consultant at Oliver Wyman many, many years ago. But we're very pleased and excited by the work done by Oliver Wyman and Mercer on the study on the cost of inconsistency.
Thank you. We're going to go to the next slide, and we're going to do a poll. So if everybody could look at this, what is your background or interest in for marriage equality and LGBT global mobility? Select all that apply. What is your background? So HR, D&I, ally, interested, and we will, if you do that and submit that, then you'll be able to see what is tracking. So we're still getting a lot of results in. Approximately 72% are interested or impacted, and then it goes to HR professional and D&I. So we'll give that maybe a few more seconds. So about 76% just an impacted person, and then 25 and 25 on D&I and HR. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Katie, and we're going to look at the cost of inconsistency. So Katie?
Great, thank you very much. The Cost of Inconsistency is a report that was published November 2014, and I'm going to skip forward here. The main finding from our report was that inconsistent marriage laws imposed a $1.3 billion burden on American businesses in 2014. This report was written in a partnership with Out and Equal, Freedom to Marry, and the Marsh & McLennan Companies. Report was written by Oliver Wyman, and Mercer was able to provide human capital support and a network for us to reach out to. I'm going to dive right into the content and speak to you about that. If you do have any questions, please feel free to input them in the chat, and if we don't address them during the call, we'll speak to them afterwards. As many of you are familiar, there is a patchwork quilt of widely varying marriage laws across the U.S., and these marriage laws continue to remain highly irregular. Freedom to marry exists in some states, prohibited in others. There are other states where there's ongoing court rulings, and the verdict is up in the air. This, in combination with the fact that many businesses provide equal benefits to their employees and offer domestic partner benefits to same-sex couples in states without the freedom to marry, result in increased costs for businesses and their partnered LGBT employees. Employers face two costs. They bear administrative burdens when trying to implement and manage these benefits across multiple jurisdictions with differing marriage laws. There's also the burden of taxation, and that impacts both the businesses and the LGBT employees. They bear an additional tax burden on the value of those benefits, would otherwise be considered a business expense and not capitalized, and not taxable. Our objective in this report was to quantify the economic burden on the private sector. We really wanted to understand, there is a very complex network of laws around this. How much does it cost business? If we were to make this real for businesses in a dollars perspective, what does this really mean? So first, we calculated the administrative burden to employers of managing benefits for partnered LGBT employees. Second, we calculated the additional tax burden on employees and employers when these equal benefits were offered. And what we found was, looking back to 2008 and then projecting forward to 2018, you see that over time, the economic burden of inconsistent marriage laws has been climbing. Now, there were some savings with the fall of DOMA in 2014, but again, the numbers continue to climb on an ongoing basis. And that's for a couple reasons. One of those reasons is that on an ongoing basis, more and more employers are offering domestic partner benefits to same-sex partners. And as more and more employers jump on board and treat their employees equally, you're seeing them more employers have to manage that administrative burden and pay tax-related costs. Now, one of the most interesting things here is that the ongoing costs are actually quite significant. There is a significant setup cost on the administrative side in order to do this for the first time, because you're figuring out how to make this fit within your current HR systems. You're trying to understand how to make this happen within your organization and be compliant. But on an ongoing basis, there are several areas that you accrue cost in, and those aren't going away. And those costs won't go away for businesses until the freedom to marry exists nationwide. Now, understand this map. Some of you are going to say, hey, I think that state has flipped in the past little while. Very true. When I talk about these costs, these are all dating back to November 2014. So states that are home to large multi-state employers, they bear the majority of the total economic burden of inconsistent laws. And that's because when there is a large multi-state employer, they have to manage the challenging administrative burden and compliance burden across a wide variety of states. And it's that aspect of it, that compliance aspect of it, that makes this very challenging and expensive. For those HR and benefits individuals in the room, let's talk more specifically around where the actual cost buckets accrue. Employers conduct 4 types of activities when managing the patchwork quilt of freedom to marry laws. Initially, when you're setting this up, you're just spending man hours and getting involved, creating the corporate approach. And management and HR have to assess and define how the corporation and how the organization is going to manage the offering of domestic partner benefits to same-sex couples. There's management time, there's legal expertise, there's benefits advice that happens in this, benefits costs that are accrued in this area. And then there's implementation of the policy. You go through and update benefits, payroll systems, train HR, communicate the policy to employees. In some instances, there were some large corporations that had to retrain 5,000 different HR individuals, and that can accrue a large cost. On an ongoing basis, and this has to happen annually, you're managing employee relations and maintaining systems. Any new employee coming on board, anybody who wants to move to a different state or has any change in their marital status or relationship status, the calculation of imputed income and what the income impact is of providing these employees with different benefits. This all costs money and this all takes time. And then there's monitoring the policy changes and ensuring compliance. Let's look at what this actually adds up to. And what you'll see is that for small, medium, and large employers, there is a significant cost, especially relative to how large their business is. For a small employer, sub 500 employees, this can be $15,000 to implement domestic partner benefit provision and maintain it. Now, for large employees, we've seen some employers on average be around the $250,000 to $300,000 mark. We also saw some large employers spend upwards of millions of dollars making this happen and launching these benefits across their entire organization. A couple areas that result in this getting more complex is the more bureaucracy you have, the more complex this is. Early adopters spent a lot more money making this happen because it was the first time benefits companies had really thought through these problems and had to develop payroll systems that manage this. There's also communication cost, and that's largely dependent on the type of communication that an employer wants to make, particularly if they're in a state that is more, does not have the freedom to marry, and that's where their home base is. They have to spend quite a bit. We've seen organizations spend quite a bit of money making sure that they're voicing this and making their decision known to the local government officials. At a national level, the administrative burden is split roughly evenly across small, medium, and large employers. Small employers, there are just more of them. They spend less on a per employer basis. Large employers are spending more money per employer, but there are fewer of them. Interesting to note, though, the hurdle for small employers really comes the first time they try to do this. The national tax burden is significantly smaller than the administrative burden, and that was interesting for us to see. It's concentrated as well on employers and employees in states without the freedom to marry. Let's make this real with an example. Let's talk about two different families. And I know now that this isn't exactly the best. These aren't the best states to use for this example. But thinking back to November 2014, putting yourself in a time warp, if there were a married partner, same-sex partner in Minnesota, before Windsor, they would have paid an additional about $2,500 in tax per year. But with the Windsor ruling in the fall of DOMA and the recognition of their marriage, they had a 16% tax savings. Now, the challenge was with an unmarried partner in Montana in 2014, they didn't recognize any of those cost savings, and they were still paying a burden because for these couples, their marriage wasn't recognized. And so when they received domestic partner benefits, that was considered additional income, and they were taxed on that. Windsor did save a significant amount of money. However, what Windsor didn't do was eliminate the burden overall. Because what Windsor didn't do was eliminate the inconsistency. And the real problem here is that every single day of inconsistent marriage laws persist, it costs the private sector $3.5 million. Fall of DOMA was great. When DOMA was overturned, 5-year savings after that were $3.3 billion to the private sector. And let's not forget that this doesn't just impact businesses. This impacts individuals and families. And income taxes can be up to 16% higher for different individuals if they're living in a state that doesn't recognize the freedom to marry. I think one of the most important things that we learned in this report was that when we spoke with employers, at the end of the day, they just said, I just wanted to do the right thing by my employees. I never once thought about how much this would cost me. And to be honest, most of these employers, after we spoke to them, said, I never actually realized how much this cost me. But it's important to make sure that we understand that inconsistent regulatory action does cost the system money. And a Supreme Court ruling would save the U.S. economy money and allow us to put different types of resources back to more productive use. Now with that, I would like to hand this over to my colleague, to Scott Davenport, a prior colleague, for him to speak more about Freedom to Marry today.
Katie, we are colleagues. We're all doing this great work together. Thanks very much, Katie. I think you can see from the slides that the folks at Wyman and Mercer and Marcia McLennan really did an amazing job of sort of digging into this, getting to the nitty-gritty of it, and coming up with some numbers which I think are eye-opening, and which in the end were really quite powerful, because the study itself became a major component of what is called the business amicus brief, which was filed with the Supreme Court in advance of the oral arguments on the Freedom to Marry, which happened just this past Tuesday. I have to. Many of you may have heard of that, and we have a little poll to see whether or not your companies became part of that effort or not. You could just click on the poll, and we can see what kind of results there are. Ooh, lots of folks. That's great. So far, I'm seeing about roughly half the group is in the yes category, and a bunch of folks aren't really quite sure. So this is something you may want to do coming out of the presentation today is look to see. You can come to our website at freedomtomarry.org, and you can see the full list. There were almost 400 businesses here in the U.S. Many of them, I think we had 60% of the Fortune 100 companies in the country sign on to this amicus brief. And basically what they were doing is they were saying, you know what, from our perspective, for us to do the right thing as a business, we believe that it's important for the Freedom to Marry to come to the entire country and to not have this sort of patchwork quilt. One of the reasons is cost, but one of the reasons, as you heard, is that we want to just do the right thing for our employees. So let me give you a very quick rundown on where we stand, and then I'll probably be handing it over to another of our colleagues here. And we can come back and you can ask me more questions, particularly coming out of oral arguments on Tuesday. We at Freedom to Marry have had a very explicit victory to get us to the point where we are now, and hopefully to win this thing finally, hopefully as early as June. And that is a three-pronged, what we called roadmap to victory. The first is to focus on winning more states, so that more and more Americans live in a state with the Freedom to Marry, and they can see for themselves that the Freedom to Marry hurts no one and only helps LGBT families, their kids, their spouses, and the community as a whole, which then helps build public support. And our goal was 60%. We currently are at somewhere between 60 and 63%, depending on what kind of poll you look at. So we were very gratified that we were able to accomplish that. And ultimately, number three there is to bring a complete end to federal marriage discrimination. That didn't happen completely with the Windsor decision, which overturned major sections of DOMA, but the vast bulk of the federal marriage discrimination that DOMA represented was in fact overturned. And we're hopeful that when we have final resolution, which would be a positive decision coming out of the Supreme Court, that all of that will have been dealt with. So that's a very quick overview. As you know, we just had oral arguments at the Supreme Court. Our take on that was that they went very, very well, that we've made a very strong case to the court, that we've made a very strong case in the court of public opinion, and that's been very important as the court weighs the kind of change that they see in front of them versus the discrimination that is represented. We're very very hopeful that we will get a positive decision come June. So with that, as I said, we will take questions as we go. Let me hand it over to my colleague Michael at William & Mercer.
Thanks very much, and thanks for joining, everybody. So we're going to kick off the session on global mobility with another spot poll. So if everybody would like to answer the question here on the screen, we can see what the results are. It looks like the vast majority of people at the moment are working for a multinational company, with a good proportion also working domestically in the United States. So I appreciate that actually the concept of global mobility indicates that it does go beyond one country's national borders, but I think a lot of the topics that we're going to be talking about today, and as Katie alluded to in her presentation, some of these topics do actually affect domestic relocations as well. So what I'll do is I'll go right ahead and move on to the beginning of the presentation. So we began looking at this in the context of talent management, which is the part of the business that I specialize in. And the key focus for us really was that in today's economy, in the 21st century, skills have become the key driver of individual well-being and economic success, both on an individual level and on a personal level. But the sort of flip side to that is that globally we are just emerging from one of the deepest recessions in history, and we've got 200 million unemployed people, and 34% of employers saying that they can't find the talent to fill their jobs. And this is especially acute in certain industries such as oil and gas. So what a lot of companies do is they either develop their talent, so they build their talent by training them and giving them opportunities to acquire new skills and experience. But the vast majority buy this talent, so they go out to other firms who have already got the talent that they need and focus on recruiting them into the organization. But the part that hasn't been focused on so much, but is increasingly becoming part of organizations' focus, is this idea of borrowing staff from one organization to another within the same group. And that is essentially the concept of mobility. So it might be, for example, relocating somebody from New York to Alabama, for example, but in the context of global mobility, recruiting individuals or asking individuals to relocate internationally. And this is increasingly common as firms are seeing the strategic importance of global mobility in winning that war for talent that we talked about before. But in the LGBT context, employee preferences are changing as well, or in general, and so we recently, or Boston Consulting Group recently did some research that showed that nearly 2/3 of employees globally would consider working abroad, although that was considerably lower in the US. But actually among the millennials, among Generation Y, the figure was almost as high as the global figure, with 59% saying that they would be willing to work abroad. And coincidentally, the most appealing countries to move to, such as the UK, the US, Australia and Canada, are coincidentally some of the most appealing, some of the most LGBT-friendly countries, at least when you look at a global level. And this sort of this increased statistic for the millennials is especially the case because international experience is now seen as crucial for moving into senior leadership development, senior leadership positions, for example, and actually international experience is one of the key traits of the millennial, as well along with career progression. So as more firms are looking to use mobility as a tool to plug talent shortages, and as more employees are looking to have some sort of international experience, I thought we would reflect, and given that 50% of the folks, or less than 50% of the folks, have got an HR-focused role of some kind, I thought we could focus a little bit on why firms are sending people on assignment. And as you can see, it's a very close tie for these top 5 positions. But the vast majority are to provide skills, whether they are technical or managerial, in a role that aren't available locally. With the other very important, and the second most important part, being the idea of developing people's careers, giving them new skills and experience. So effectively, there is both a career development but also a business strategic side of things. The problem then becomes that we are looking at quite a narrow talent pool, or historically we've been looking at a very narrow pool of talent. And we saw the statistic earlier about firms being concerned about finding the right talent for certain roles, but this is especially acute in the case of finding candidates suitable for international assignments. So of the firms that Mercer surveyed globally, so that's nearly 900 firms globally, 88% were concerned about finding suitable candidates for international assignments. And as you can see, the vast majority of those on international assignments, those with international experience, are men. Our Mercer statistics showed that only 14% of the assignee population globally were female. And this is actually in stark contrast to a lot of the progress that has been made on a domestic level around the world, where, for example, women hold over 50% of middle manager roles, but actually only 14% are on assignment. And then as we focus more on the topic in hand today, LGBT mobility, the truth is there isn't an awful lot of information out there, or there wasn't an awful lot of information out there. One of the reasons being that, of course, the LGBT or sexuality is an invisible difference. And some research that we found from the Human Rights Campaign was that over 50% aren't out at work. So there's also a challenge for firms to identify who within their talent pool is LGBT so that they can create processes that support that. So when we look at LGBT employees specifically and within the context of global mobility, we've talked before about how Generation Y are very keen to undertake some sort of international assignment, to have an international experience. But actually, Generation Y, who may well have come out at high school, who may well have come out at university, 62% of them go back in the closet when they start their first job. And here in the UK, the Institute of Engineering and Technology did a survey of its employees to find out their views on LGBT issues. 42% of engineers said that they hid their sexuality from their work colleagues, and 17% of them said that they believed their sexuality was a barrier to career progression. Now, the reason I've chosen these statistics is that the engineering sector, whether it's in oil and gas, whether it's in mining, or more broadly, is a very international sector. And when you enter the engineering career path, it's very likely that you will be offered some sort of international experience. So for 17% of them to say that their sexuality is a barrier to career progression is particularly stark. And then when asked why they felt that their sexuality was such a barrier, many stated that homophobic laws in certain countries and regions was the main barrier and prevented them from undertaking projects. Now, if we think about some of the major engineering projects that we could all think about off the top of our head, it might be, for example, some oil and gas pipelines running from the Middle East into Turkey, from Russia into Ukraine, etc., all of which are not particularly LGBT-friendly locations at all. And then when we looked at where organizations were planning to send or planning to increase the number of expats, these countries, these 8 countries were the top 8. And just for those of you who can't see, the bottom one is Russia. And so we've got clearly locations here that are more LGBT friendly than others. So the likes of the UK, actually Mexico and Brazil on a global level being reasonably LGBT friendly. But then you've also got China with 41% expecting an increase, the UAE and of course Russia, the latter two of course posing extreme risks to the LGBT community. So we sort of have this this conundrum effectively where firms are increasingly realizing the value of diversity and are encouraging their staff to bring their whole selves to work. But in the same breath, firms are looking to new markets to grow, to develop their staff, to insist that their staff have international experience in order to progress. But that may involve LGBT employees having to travel to locations that are either hostile or up to extremely unsafe for LGBT employees. And so here in Mercer, we wanted to explore this topic a little bit and bring together our expertise in mobility and D&I and look into this a little bit more. And so what we're trying to do is set against these particular topics, so firms wanting to find growth and exploit opportunities in emerging markets, while also winning the war for talent and getting the required talent with skills that they need. But also the importance of these values. If we're thinking that by 2020, millennials are going to comprise 50% of the workforce, and millennials place a strong emphasis on diversity and a strong emphasis on gaining international experience, how do firms balance their values of diversity with the need to grow and move into new markets? And then, of course, there are certain barriers to LGBT employees, which we'll explore a little bit, and then talking to firms about how they might adapt their policies and train their staff to make them more aware of the issues that LGBT employees face when relocating abroad. And so we tried to bring all of this together, and we developed back in the summer of last year a questionnaire which was sent out by Mercer in North America and also by Out and Equal to its members. And we wanted to look at the different approaches that firms were taking precisely on these issues. And we came up with some really interesting findings. So on an LGBT level, 48% of the firms that responded said that they did have a global diversity and inclusion policy that made specific reference to LGBT staff. But as we talked about earlier, with sexuality being an invisible difference, it was interesting that 93% of these North American employers didn't track sexual orientation as part of the demographics that they recorded for their staff. Now, what that means to me is that the firm these organizations aren't aware of the scale of the issue, and there may well be a lot of deep issues that they're not aware about. However, of those who were more aware of the issues, 56% stated that compliance matters like tax and immigration were the main barrier to LGBT mobility. Now, when we unpack that a little bit, we're talking here about same-sex marriage or civil partnerships not being recognised, and the LGBT employee not being able to relocate to another country with their partner. Similarly, it may be that the family makeup in the home country, where, for example, a same-sex couple have adopted a child, the parental rights are not recognised in the host country, which, of course, when we're talking about relocating abroad and not being able to take your family with you, is almost guaranteed to put the brakes on the assignment altogether. The other compliance piece that Katie's been talking about an awful lot here is with regards to some of the incremental costs on tax. So even countries that do recognise same-sex partnerships and same-sex marriage, for example, Germany, they don't necessarily allow firms to, or individuals to grant their same-sex partners access to their healthcare, for example, without there being an incremental cost to either the employee or the employer. And of course, if it's borne by the employer, then that's going to increase the overall cost of mobility, which is already extremely expensive. But interestingly, nearly a quarter of the organisations that we polled said that there were no barriers to LGBT mobility. I'd like to think that that was because they were all extremely positive optimists that didn't see any barriers to anything. But actually, I think it's feeding quite nicely into the next statistic there, which is stating that actually 61% of the firms that we spoke to were admitted that they were unaware of the local cultural and legal conditions for LGBT staff. Now, I think this ignorance of the barriers that LGBT employees face, along with the lack of awareness of the particular landscape that the employee might be relocating into, is an area that firms can definitely address by increasing awareness of LGBT issues and training their staff all the way through from the global mobility practitioners down to the line managers. And the line managers here were seen to be a really key group, as they are often the ones that put forward the individuals for assignment. But despite all of these risks and despite these barriers, the vast majority of firms, 91%, said that they didn't restrict their employees from travelling to certain regions. And of the firms that did say that they wouldn't allow LGBT employees to relocate, locations like Uganda, Nigeria, but actually locations like Singapore were also listed because of their strict laws. So what can firms do to support LGBT employees? Well, those with best practice would offer something like a legal briefing and some cultural training so that the individual is aware of the issues that they might face so that they can make the decision on their own. While other firms, realizing that it might not be possible to relocate the employee to a hostile environment, offered an alternative assignment type. Now, what we mean by that is, instead of fully relocating to the host country, they would be allowed, for example, to commute. And while other employers offered an alternative assignment location. But as we mentioned earlier, one of the key things that firms can do here is increase awareness of these issues, both to line managers and to the global mobility staff. But actually, 64%, nearly 2/3, don't offer training to managers on these issues. So, in terms of what we can all do as interested parties or HR practitioners or even as allies, I've tried to identify some individual individual actions that people can take. So when it comes to choosing a candidate for an international assignment, I think first of all we have to understand that different candidates have different expectations of mobility, and there is unconscious bias. And by that we're saying, for example, where an individual doesn't know that a member of staff is gay, that they would offer them an assignment, expect them to take it, and not understand why the individual will turn it down without having to come out. But on the flip side, it's knowing that the individual is LGBT and saying he or she won't want to relocate to that country because they're gay. We really need to improve the candidate selection process. Similarly, once the individual has been identified and is ready to go on assignment, we need to make sure that the mobility team is prepared, that we have the flexible elements of the policy that is needed to ensure the assignee's family can accompany, and that the firm is aware of the compliance issues that the individual and the firm might face. And then we need to make sure that the employee is ready as well by offering them those kinds of legal, cultural briefings that are going to equip them to make the success of an assignment. But similarly, we also need to think about our suppliers. So many firms, when they are dealing with international assignments, will outsource to immigration providers, tax providers, shipping companies, etc. And we need to make sure that those organisations are skilled and aware. And then when individuals are on assignment, we also need to make sure that the line manager in the host country is equipped to manage diverse talent. If we've got, for example, a lot of employees relocating out of the US and out of the UK, you can often forget that actually that might be quite a challenge in a workplace or a workplace culture like Italy, where it isn't as open perhaps, and that line manager might need some support. And we need to keep communicating. The feedback that we receive from the individual employees on what life is really like in the country is very important in order to help the mobility function and help other candidates come out of the woodwork and put themselves forward and ensure equal opportunities for LGBT talent. And then similarly, firms need to be aware of the potential incremental cost and take a position on the equalisation of those benefits that we talked about earlier. And another important part, if, for example, somebody does adopt a child or does have a baby while on assignment, we need to be mindful of the fact that that baby may not be recognised in the host country. And then once the assignment's over, we need to get that feedback. We need to understand that actually after the individual has returned home, there may be a culture shock. The reason we've included that is because when we were doing this research, we found, for example, a lot of employees out of Asia, out of, for example, India, that relocated to the UK who weren't out in the home country, in India, that came out when they were here in the UK, had met a partner and then didn't want to go home. They didn't want to go back to India. They couldn't take their partner with them and they had to go back in the closet. And what can firms do to support that individual when they're back in the home country? So in conclusion today, there are three parts I think that we can all try and take some action on. The top being something that all of us can do, and it's focused on the workplace's culture. So create a workplace where people feel that they can be open about their personal circumstances, promote the organisation's values, and actually leverage your LGBT networks. So for those of you on the phone who are co-chairs of LGBT networks, perhaps make a point of trying to find out who the mobility practitioners are within your organisation and understand what people are, what the firm's doing about it, and raise awareness. If you're a line manager or if you're in a position to influence training and learning and development in a firm, try and get unconscious bias and diversity training on the agenda for all line managers. And then with regards to HR policies, if any of you have the potential to impact these, check them for their inclusivity and their flexibility, and then partner with the mobility and D&I teams, and this is also the case for LGBT networks, to support the organisation's strategic goals. But most of all, if you're not sure what you're dealing with or who is affected by these issues, I would encourage you to try and gather as much data as possible to provide those insights, raise awareness with senior individuals, and that I find will get you a lot of traction. That's all from me, and now I'm going to hand over back to Pat, I believe, for the Q&A.
And Tony, do you want to ask the questions, or do you want me to go ahead and take them?
No, I'll ask them, and people can chat in your questions. And there were a couple that I captured. If I don't get them right, Pat, you can correct me. But one of the questions that came in, and I will ask this to Scott. So we'll go there first, and then anybody else could chime in. Are there still federal taxes for domestic partner benefits in states that don't have marriage equality? So we talk about that once you have marriage equality and the federal government and those tax laws, but what about the states that don't have that, and are there still federal taxes on that income in those states? And I don't know, Scott, if you have that at the top of your head or not.
Yeah, so actually that is one of the things which, thanks in some respect to the Obama administration, they have been eliminated. So if you are married, regardless of whether or not you live in a state that honors that marriage or not as a same-sex couple, there is no imputed income for the benefits that you receive as a result of that marriage. Now, if, however, you live in a state that doesn't offer marriage, and you get domestic partner benefits because you are not in fact married, you haven't gone to another state that would offer it, the benefits associated, the imputed income associated with those benefits are taxable because your status remains unmarried.
Thanks, Scott. Another question that we had, and I think, Michael, you touched on it briefly, was about India, about, when we looked at that LGBT mobility, what were your findings? And I think you got to some of that, but any more detail specific to India? I know you gave the example of someone from India who had moved to the UK, but any other pieces that might have been found out during that study with corporations and the recriminalization in India?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we took a global view and we didn't focus on any particular areas in specific, but when we were talking with organizations about what they do, and we're talking really here about best practice, we found that actually a number of firms were very supportive of moves into Asian locations where the law is not particularly open or friendly. And a good example of that is Singapore, where we think of Singapore as being a very economically developed and powerful nation, but actually on LGBT issues, the law is still very draconian. But clearly, a vast majority of multinational companies will have operations there, and need to relocate their talent there. And so what a lot of organizations are doing is sponsoring the spouse's visa, for example, so that they can accompany them and live as two separate people from an immigration perspective, but still go about their life. And locations like Hong Kong and Singapore, you are able to do that because actually the vast majority of not the vast majority, but a large portion of the society there is an expat, are expats. And so actually the society in Singapore is actually reasonably LGBT friendly, and there is a Pride March every year, and there are gay bars and sort of quite an active LGBT community, but actually it's the law. So often the reverse side of that is Japan, where actually some of the laws are quite LGBT friendly, but society is very conservative and not very open towards LGBT. And so I think it's taking that legal and the societal and bringing those together, and that's often the case in Asia, which is very much a mix of those two issues.
Thanks, Michael. Another question we had, and I will throw it out to Scott as well, was prior to oral arguments, there was a lot of optimism, and I know that, Scott, you had talked about the fact that things seem very positive and optimistic, but the sense was that the question is that it seems more pessimistic tone or questioning tone, and what would be the general takeaways from the arguments with the Supreme Court?
Yeah, I think that may be in fact what a lot of people feel is going on right now, but I think a lot of that comes from a misperception of the way in which the Supreme Court operates. Because it had rejected a number of the it allowed to expire a number of stays, which as a result allowed the freedom to marry to come to a number of states that we might not otherwise would have expected. I think there was a sense that, gee, this is a slam dunk, right, going into oral arguments. And in fact, first of all, you never can assume that there's a slam dunk at the Supreme Court. And number two, the nature of oral arguments is inherently one of an opportunity for the justices to challenge the attorneys on both sides of an issue, sometimes regardless of what position they may be formulating in their own minds about how they will vote. And so, for instance, there was a lot of conversation about Kennedy, who of course is viewed as the swing vote on marriage. The fact that he was musing about how, gee, this is, it's the institution of opposite sex marriage has been the standard for millennia, and this is it's such a quick change, so to speak. But then later in the conversation, he reverts to many of the kinds of things that have been the hallmark of his decisions around how the institution bestows dignity on LGBT people and their families, and how critical that is, and so on and so forth. So, in some cases, people see those things and they're like, well, why is he saying those things? But that's the nature of what he's doing, is he's both processing for himself as well as making points with the court. And a lot of what may be going on may be things being signaled between justices that we don't really even understand. The reason we remain optimistic is because of the pattern that we saw coming into the court, and the continued reliance, particularly of Justice Kennedy, on some of the things that have been the hallmark of his decisions up till now. But we know that there's nothing that we can do to rely on anything like that. It's everything that you read now will simply be speculation, tea leaf reading, whatever you want to call it. And all we can do at this point is continue to press the case, as we call it in the court of public opinion, to continue to demonstrate that the country is ready, that more and more people are supportive of the freedom to marry, that more and more unlikely individuals, conservatives, evangelicals, people in the South, whatever whatever constituency you can think of, are in fact evolving in terms of their opinions on marriage, and that this is the right thing to do. That ending discrimination in marriage hurts no one and will only benefit families and the community as a whole.
Thanks, Scott. I'm going to take one last question, and actually I will give the answer to it, and then we'll leave some time for closing comments from Katie, Michael, and Scott. The last question is, if an LGBT employee wants to research employment opportunities in another country or even within the U.S., what resources would you recommend? And this may not be exactly the idea that the person was thinking, but the way that I would approach it is, if you know that there is an opportunity with a company and you're interested in that company, so what is their non-discrimination policy? Does it include sexual orientation? Does it have gender identity? Does it have gender expression? What is their history on that? Do they have an LGBT ERG? Can you go out to their website and find that information on that ERG? What has been their stand? Did they sign on to the amicus brief? And what is their CEI? That would be the approach if an LGBT employee is interested in a company and they want to better understand what that environment might be. That would be my recommendation to really get a sense of whether that would be a good fit and what's that company's history. With that, because we have about 5 minutes to go, I'm going to go to closing comments, and so we'll go in the same order. Katie, Michael, Scott, I will give you each like a minute or so to just provide closing comments for the presentation. Katie?
Great, thank you very much. I think one of the greatest things about getting to work on this report was getting to speak to so many different individuals in senior leadership, in HR departments, and really understand how they thought about this issue and how they thought about managing all the inconsistent laws. And I think one of the biggest takeaways that I personally had here was that nobody ever thought about the cost when they went about doing this. This was the right thing to do by their employees. And what we heard time and time again was it didn't matter how much resources we had to throw against this. This is what we had to do in order to represent what we believed in. And it's unfortunate that the legal system is penalizing us by doing right by our employees. And so I think what's really interesting is that hearing, taking that quote, taking those anecdotes, and then being able to put a dollar behind things really makes it real how much work really goes into providing equal benefits to individuals when the legal system fails them. So it's been a great honor for me to get to work with individuals at Freedom to Marry and at Out and Equal in order to quantify the burden that employers have faced in trying to provide equal benefits to their LGBT employees with regards to domestic partner benefits.
Thank you, Katie. Michael?
Thanks, both. Yeah, I would just like to conclude on the fact that actually, as the world globalizes more and as more people do want to relocate, this is going to be a big issue. And I think that both global mobility professionals who want to move from being more reactive to more strategic can really differentiate themselves in the eyes of the powers that be in their firms by raising these kinds of strategic issues. But similarly, LGBT networks who maybe again want to align with the firm's values, demonstrate their reason for existing to the firm, can actually leverage this topic as a really good way of showing their value and promoting these issues to both internally and also outside to clients.
And
Michael,
this is Scott. Thanks. So I just wanted to end with two thoughts. The first is, again, to say thanks, and I apologize for the sirens. I have an office here in New York City that's right across the street from a firehouse. I wanted to say thank you again to the folks at Oliver Wyman and Mercer and Marcia McLennan, and to the folks at Out and Equal for helping to make the study on the patchwork quilt happen. As I said, I think it's been an incredibly important part of the broader conversation on marriage. And in fact, that's the second point and the final point that I would like to make, which is if you're wondering if, is there anything still that can be done that we can still do to make marriage happen here in the States? Even though we are now, in effect, waiting on the Supreme Court to render its decision, the key thing that you can keep doing is having conversations. The one thing which has been the most powerful mover of the public on marriage is the more and more conversations that individuals, neighbors, business colleagues, work colleagues have had about why marriage matters to them and what a difference it would make for them. And so I would encourage you to keep doing that in the workplace. The more that you as employers can structure opportunities for that through seminars or what have you, what would it mean if the Freedom to Marry happened in Texas and you happen to be a Texas-based company? Anything along those lines will continue to help move that conversation forward, and that's what will make a difference.
Thanks, Scott. And I would like to thank everyone, Oliver Wyman, Mercer, Freedom to Marry. This was both projects were awesome to be a part of. Thank all the Marcia McLennan companies, and really enjoy everybody dialing in. And hopefully, you've gotten a lot about this, and you can share this with your colleagues because it has been taped. It will be out on our website. And with that, I will turn it over to Pat, or Pat's already taken the screen.
Thanks, everybody, for your participation as well. Great questions and comments. We sent out a couple of links. We'll include those in the follow-up email that'll have the recording and the slides as well. Please make sure you complete the survey at the end of the call. Let us know thoughts about this call and others. We'll talk to you next month on May 28th on self-ID, be able to share some of that. As always, Out and Equal, if you consider a donation, we would love to have that support as well. And to let people know and to share this. If it's a good conversation, is to share it with your companies. We'll see you in Dallas. The registration is open now, and information is up on the website, October 5th through 8th in Dallas. And if you've got any more questions or want to make any reaching out to any of the presenters, you can come through me, or we'll include that in the follow-up message as well. So thanks, and we'll see you next month.